The late afternoon sun spilled through the curtains of my sewing room, casting long golden streaks across the hardwood floor. I was knee-deep in a cleaning spree, the kind that hits you out of nowhere when the quiet of the house gets too loud. My hands were dusty from sorting through old fabric scraps and half-finished projects when I reached into a wooden box tucked on the bottom shelf. My fingers brushed against something cool and smooth, a sleek silver keepsake I hadn't touched in years. It wasn't innocent, not by any stretch, but it wasn't crude either. Just a private relic from a life I'd boxed up long ago. I pulled it out, turning it over in my hands, lost in the hum of my own thoughts. Then the door creaked. I spun around, heart lurching into my throat. There stood Mason, my stepson, leaning against the frame like he owned the place. His hazel eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite pin down. Curiosity, maybe, or mischief. He was 25, tall and wiry, with a mess of dark hair that always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed. He wasn't supposed to be home. He worked odd hours at the auto shop down the road, usually crashing with friends after a shift. Yet here he was, catching me off guard with that damn half-smile of his. "What's that, Grace?" His voice was light, teasing, but it carried an edge that made my stomach flip. My cheeks went hot, red-hot like I'd been caught stealing. I fumbled, and the keepsake slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the floor. In a panic, I snatched the nearest thing, a quilt I'd been folding, and threw it over the offending object like it was evidence in a crime scene. "Nothing you need to worry about," I snapped, my voice sharper than I meant it to be. I could feel my throat tightening, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Mason didn't flinch. If anything, his smirk grew, and he tilted his head, resting one shoulder against the doorframe. "You don't have to act so jumpy," he said, crossing his arms. "It's not like I haven't seen something like that before." I wanted to disappear, crawl under the floorboards and never come up. The nerve of him, standing there so casual, so unbothered, while my whole world tilted off its axis. He wasn't a kid anymore, sure, but he was still Henry's son. Still my stepson. I forced a laugh, desperate to claw back some control. "Mason, seriously, go mind your own business. You shouldn't even be in here." He didn't budge. For a moment, the room went quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on you until you can hear your own pulse. His eyes weren't on the quilt anymore. They were on me. And it wasn't the usual lazy glance I'd gotten used to over the years, the one that said he was just passing through. This look lingered, heavy and deliberate, like he was seeing something he hadn't noticed before. My skin prickled. A flicker of warmth sparked deep in my chest, sharp and uninvited, followed by a stab of guilt that hit like a punch. This was wrong. Whatever this was, it was dead wrong. I was his stepmother, for God's sake, married to his father, living under the same roof, keeping the same routines. I shook my head, breaking the spell. "Please, Mason, just go." He shrugged, lifting his hands in mock surrender. All right," he said, his tone sliding back to that easy drawl he used to dodge anything serious. But before he turned away, he gave me one last look, a slow, steady once-over that sent my already rattled thoughts spinning into chaos. The door clicked shut behind him, and I sank onto the edge of the sewing table, the quilt still bunched in my arms. My heart was racing, a wild thudding I couldn't quiet. I didn't even try to pick up the keepsake from the floor. It felt tainted now, like it had betrayed me. I sat there for a minute, maybe two, staring at the faded floral pattern on the quilt. The room smelled of lavender and old thread, a comforting mix that usually grounded me. Not today. Something had shifted. Something I couldn't name but could damn well feel, like a thread pulled loose in a seam, threatening to unravel everything. I pressed my hands to my face, willing my breath to steady. Mason was just a kid. Well, a man now, but still too young, too close, too everything. I'd always kept the lines clear, the boundaries firm. So why did it feel like he'd just stepped right over them without even trying? The worst part? Some small, reckless corner of me didn't mind. I stood up, brushing my hands on my jeans, and forced myself to move. I had to get out of this room, away from that silver glint still peeking out from under the quilt. But as I stepped into the hall, I knew one thing for certain. No matter how hard I tried to shove this moment down, it wasn't going away. Mason's eyes, that smirk, the way he'd looked at me. They'd lodged themselves in my head, and I had a sinking feeling they weren't leaving anytime soon. The kitchen smelled of onions and thyme as I stood at the counter, chopping vegetables for a stew I barely cared about making. It was evening now, the kind of late summer dusk where the light turns syrupy and slow. I'd spent the rest of the afternoon trying to scrub that sewing room moment from my mind, but it clung like damp fabric. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mason's smirk, felt the weight of his stare. My knife slipped, nicking the edge of a carrot, and I cursed under my breath. "Focus, Grace." In the den, Henry hunched over his model trains, the faint clatter of tiny wheels on tracks drifting through the house. He'd been at it for hours, his latest retirement obsession, piecing together a miniature world he could control. I didn't mind, not really. It kept him busy, kept us from tripping over each other in this quiet life we'd settled into. But tonight it left me alone with my thoughts, and that was dangerous. Upstairs, Mason's guitar strummed faintly, a restless tune that didn't match the stillness down here. I pressed the knife harder, slicing through a potato, willing the rhythm to drown him out. The floor creaked behind me. I didn't turn, but I knew it was him. Mason padded in, barefoot, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. He opened the fridge, the soft hiss of it cutting through the silence, and pulled out a beer. "Rough day?" he asked, popping the cap with a flick of his thumb. His voice was casual, like he hadn't just turned my afternoon upside down. I kept my eyes on the cutting board. "Could say the same about you," I shot back, forcing a lightness I didn't feel. "Thought you'd be out with your buddies by now." He leaned against the counter, close enough that I caught the faint scent of motor oil and cedar clinging to him. "Nah, figured I'd stick around tonight." He took a sip, watching me over the bottle. "This house feels like a cage sometimes, doesn't it?" The words made me pause, my knife hovering mid-chop. I glanced at him, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, but there was a flicker of something serious in his hazel eyes. "I don't know. Just being back here, living under this roof. It's like I'm stuck in someone else's story." He tilted his head, studying me. "You ever feel that way?" My chest tightened. I turned back to the vegetables, scraping them into a pot with more force than necessary. "It's a house, Mason, not a prison." But his question lingered, stirring up things I didn't want to face. I grabbed a rag and started wiping the counter, needing something to do with my hands. He didn't move, just stood there, sipping his beer, the air between us growing thick. "About earlier," he started, his tone shifting to that playful lilt I was starting to dread. "You don't have to be so embarrassed, you know." My hand froze mid-wipe. I turned to him, gripping the rag like a lifeline. "Mason, let's not talk about that, all right? It was an accident, not worth bringing up again." He raised his hands in surrender, but that teasing edge in his smile didn't fade. Okay, just saying. We're all human, Grace. No big deal." He stepped closer, brushing past me to toss the bottle cap in the trash. His arm grazed mine, and I caught that cedar scent again, sharp and warm. My stomach flipped, a traitor to every ounce of sense I had left. I didn't turn around, but I could feel him behind me for a beat longer than he needed to be. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, and leaned against the counter, the cool edge pressing into my palms. The pot simmered on the stove, steam curling up in lazy wisps, but I barely noticed. My mind was a mess. Mason's voice, his closeness, the way he'd looked at me earlier. It was nothing, I told myself. Just a kid. Well, a man, messing with me because he could. But it didn't feel like nothing. I plated the stew later, setting the table while Henry shuffled in from the den, muttering about a derailment he couldn't fix. He barely glanced at me as he sat, already reaching for the salt. That was normal. His world was trains and tools now, not me. I didn't resent it, not exactly. It was easier that way. No questions, no expectations. But tonight, it left me adrift. Mason came down last, his hair tousled, wearing a faded gray t-shirt that hugged his shoulders a little too well. He slid into his chair with a, "Hey, smells good," and I forced a smile, my pulse kicking up for no reason I could justify. We ate in near silence, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound. Henry grumbled about the weather, something about rain messing with his garden tomorrow. I nodded, half listening, my eyes darting to Mason more than they should have. He caught me once, holding my gaze just long enough to make my throat go dry, then went back to his food like nothing happened. Henry didn't notice a damn thing. After dinner, I cleared the plates, the routine a lifeline to normalcy. Henry sank into his recliner, flipping on some old war documentary, the drone of it filling the house. I stayed in the kitchen, washing dishes by hand, even though we had a machine. The hot water stung my fingers, grounding me, but then I heard the floor creak again. Mason was back, leaning in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low, like he didn't want Henry to hear. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on the sink. "I've got it." He didn't leave. "You sure? You've been running around all day." "I'm fine," I said, sharper than I meant to. I turned off the faucet and grabbed a towel, drying my hands just to have something to do. He stepped closer, and I could feel the heat of him, the way the space between us shrank. "Mason, go watch TV with your dad." He smirked, but there was something softer in it this time. "He's already snoring." He nodded toward the den, where sure enough, Henry's soft wheeze carried over the documentary's narration. "Guess it's just us." I swallowed hard, clutching the towel. "Good night, Mason," I said, brushing past him, my shoulder grazing his chest as I went. I didn't look back, but I felt his eyes on me all the way down the hall. My heart was pounding, and I hated how much I wanted him to follow. Morning light crept through the kitchen blinds, painting thin stripes across the table where we sat for breakfast. I'd been up early, cracking eggs into a skillet, toasting bread, pouring coffee. Anything to keep my hands busy and my mind off last night. Henry was already there, hunched over the newspaper, grumbling about the humidity and how it had ruined his tomato plants. I slid a plate in front of him, the clatter of ceramics sharp against the quiet. "Thanks, Grace," he mumbled, not looking up. "Same as always." Mason was the last to come down, his hair still damp from a shower, curling at the ends. He wore a black t-shirt and jeans, the kind of effortless look that made me notice more than I should. "Morning, Dad," he said, nodding at Henry, then turned to me with a warm smile that hit like a jolt. "Morning, Grace." My pulse quickened, and I hated it. I muttered a quick morning back and busied myself with the coffee pot, pouring a second cup I didn't need. We settled at the table, the three of us, silverware clinking as we ate. Henry rambled about the forecast between bites, oblivious to the way Mason's knee brushed mine when he shifted in his chair. I flinched, my fork scraping the plate, but I didn't pull away. Neither did he. His leg stayed there, a steady pressure I couldn't ignore, and I kept my eyes on my eggs, willing my face not to betray me. Every so often, I caught him watching me, his gaze steady, unreadable, like he was waiting for something. Henry didn't notice a thing, lost in his own world as usual. Breakfast dragged on until Henry pushed his chair back, muttering about checking the garden before the rain hit. He shuffled out, leaving his plate behind, and the back door thudded shut. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint drip of the faucet. I stood to clear the table, stacking dishes with more force than necessary. Mason stayed put, sipping his coffee, his eyes tracking me across the room. "You don't have to do that alone," he said, setting his mug down. He stood and grabbed Henry's plate before I could protest. "I'll help." "You don't have to," I said, turning to the sink, my voice tight. The last thing I needed was him close again, not after last night. "I want to," he replied, already at my side with a dish rag in hand. He didn't wait for permission, just started rinsing plates like it was the most natural thing in the world. We worked in silence for a while, the air between us buzzing with something I couldn't name. Our elbows grazed as I handed him a glass, and I felt the heat of his arm through my sleeve. My breath hitched, but I kept my focus on the suds, scrubbing harder than I needed to. "You're different," he said suddenly, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. I swallowed hard, keeping my eyes on the sink. What do you mean? He hesitated, the rag pausing mid-wipe. I don't know. You don't act like other women your age. His tone was careful, like he was testing the water. I laughed, a nervous sound that echoed off the tiles. Well, that's flattering, I suppose. I stepped back, drying my hands on a towel, needing distance. His words hung there, simple but loaded, and I didn't know how to shake them off. It's not just that, he continued, turning to face me fully. His eyes searched mine, serious now. You're real, Grace. You actually listen. You see people. The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard, like a hook snagging something deep. I didn't know what to say, so I turned back to the dishes, plunging my hands into the water again. But he didn't let it drop. I felt him shift closer, his presence a warm shadow at my back. My heart was racing, a wild thudding I couldn't quiet, and I hated how much I wanted him to stay there, just like that. The sponge slipped from my fingers, splashing into the sink, and I gripped the edge of the counter to steady myself. Grace! Henry's voice boomed from the den, shattering the moment. Where's my pruning shears? I jolted, stepping away from Mason like I'd been burned. In the garage, I called back, my voice shakier than I'd have liked. I didn't look at Mason, just grabbed a dry towel and started wiping down the counter, desperate to move, to breathe. He stayed where he was for a beat, then let out a soft chuckle. I'll let you get back to him, he said, his tone light again, like nothing had happened. He tossed the rag onto the counter and walked out, his footsteps fading down the hall. I stood there, towel clutched in my hands, a mix of relief and something sharper twisting in my chest. Longing, maybe, or regret. I couldn't tell. The rest of the morning I kept busy, folding laundry in the living room while Henry banged around in the garage. Mason disappeared upstairs, the faint strum of his guitar drifting down again. I tried to focus on the shirts in my lap, the familiar creases and folds, but my mind kept replaying his words. You're real. What did that even mean? And why did it stick with me, burrowing under my skin like a splinter? I glanced out the window, watching Henry wrestle with a tangled hose in the yard. He was oblivious, same as always, wrapped up in his own little battles. I didn't blame him, not really. It was easier that way, no cracks to slip through. But Mason? Mason saw the cracks. He saw me. And that scared me more than I wanted to admit. I pressed a folded shirt to my chest, closing my eyes for a second. The line between us was blurring, smudging into something I couldn't redraw, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to stop it. Not when some part of me, small, reckless, and growing, didn't want to. The sky hung heavy that evening, thick with the promise of a storm. Humidity clung to everything, making the air feel like a damp towel draped over the house. Henry had gone to bed early, muttering about a stiff neck from wrestling with the garden hose all day. I'd waved him off with a sleep well and settled into the living room, a paperback splayed open on my lap. The words blurred together, though. My mind was too restless to follow the story. Outside, thunder rumbled low, a warning that matched the churn in my chest. I dimmed the lamp beside me, letting shadows stretch across the room. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the old beams settling. Then I heard it, the soft clink of glass from the kitchen. Mason. The fridge door opened and shut, and I braced myself, knowing he'd show up sooner or later. Sure enough, he appeared in the doorway, holding 2 tumblers of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the faint light. Join me? He asked, raising an eyebrow as he stepped closer. He held one out, not waiting for an answer. I blinked, caught off guard. I don't usually drink this late, I said, my voice thinner than I meant it to be. Well, maybe tonight's an exception. He grinned, that easy, lopsided grin that always threw me off balance, and pressed the glass into my hand. The cool weight of it grounded me for a second, and I took it, more out of reflex than choice. He sank into the armchair across from me, stretching his legs out, his bare feet brushing the edge of the rug. The lamp cast a warm glow over him, sharpening the lines of his jaw. the faint stubble shadowing his chin. I looked away, taking a sip. The bourbon burned down my throat, a welcome sting. "What are you reading?" he asked, nodding at the book still open on my lap. "Just something light," I said, holding it up briefly before setting it on the coffee table. "Nothing exciting," he smirked. "I find that hard to believe." His tone was playful, but his eyes held mine a beat too long. I laughed softly, the sound more nervous than I wanted. Another sip of bourbon, another flicker of heat in my chest. For a while we sat there, the storm outside growing louder, wind rattling the windows, thunder rolling closer. It was almost comfortable, the silence between us, but it didn't last. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was lower now, deliberate. I glanced at him, wary. "Depends on what it is." He stared at the liquid in his tumbler, like it held the words he was looking for. "Ever feel like life's passing you by? Like you're stuck in a loop you didn't sign up for?" The question hit like a stone dropped into still water. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around my glass. "Sometimes," I admitted, quieter than I meant to. It was the truth, raw and unguarded, and I regretted it the second it slipped out. He looked up then, his eyes locking on mine. "You don't seem like someone who should be stuck, Grace. You're too alive for that." My cheeks flushed, a rush of heat I couldn't blame on the drink. I set the glass down on the table, the clink loud in the stillness. "Mason, you shouldn't say things like that." "Why not? It's true." His words hung there, thick with something unspoken, and I felt the room shrink around us. I stood abruptly, needing space, air, anything to break the pull of him. "I think it's time we called it a night," I said, avoiding his gaze as I moved toward the hall. But before I could get far, the power cut out. Darkness swallowed the room, sudden and disorienting. I froze mid-step, my breath catching. "Oh," I muttered, my voice trembling despite myself. "It's just the storm," Mason said, calm as ever. I heard him stand, the soft shuffle of his feet on the carpet. "Hold on, I'll find a flashlight." He moved closer. I could sense it, the rustle of his shirt, the shift in the air. Then his hand brushed mine in the dark, warm and steady. I sucked in a sharp breath, my skin prickling where he touched me. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't pull away. His fingers lingered, curling lightly around mine, and the air between us seemed to hum. "Grace," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned toward him, blind in the blackness, but I could feel him. His warmth, his breath, the quiet rhythm of his presence. His hand slid up to my wrist, holding it gently, and my heart pounded so loud I was sure he could hear it. "This is a bad idea," I said, my voice shaking, a plea more than a warning. "I know," he replied, but he didn't let go. Lightning cracked outside, a jagged flash that lit the room for a split second. In that fleeting glow, I saw his face, earnest, vulnerable, impossibly close. Then his lips found mine, soft at first, tentative, like he was waiting for me to push him away. But I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands gripping his shirt, fingers twisting in the fabric as the world tilted under me. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, and for a moment, nothing else existed, just the heat of him, the taste of bourbon on his breath. The lights flickered back on, a harsh jolt back to reality. We broke apart, both of us breathing hard, the space between us electric. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I pressed them to my face. "This can't happen," I said, shaking my head, my voice a fractured whisper. Mason didn't argue. He just stood there, his chest rising and falling, his expression unreadable. "I know," he said again, steady but quiet. I turned and fled to the hall, my footsteps uneven, the storm still raging outside. I didn't look back, but I could feel the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me, a line crossed I couldn't untrace. Shame flooded in, sharp and cold, but beneath it simmered something else, something alive, something I couldn't bury. I climbed the stairs to my room, the bourbon still burning in my throat, and shut the door behind me, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. The next few days blurred into a haze of avoidance. I threw myself into anything that kept me moving, scrubbing the bathroom tiles until my knuckles ached, driving to the grocery store for things we didn't need, weeding the garden until my back screamed. Anything to dodge Mason's orbit. But he was still there, a shadow at the edges of every room. At breakfast, his eyes would catch mine over the rim of his coffee mug, steady and silent. In the hall, I'd feel him pass too close, the air shifting with his presence. I'd turn away, busying myself with a dish or a dust rag, but it didn't stop the memory of his lips on mine from clawing its way back. I couldn't forget it, the way his shirt bunched under my fingers, the quiet hitch in his breath when we'd pulled apart. It was a mistake, a reckless slip, and I told myself that was all it could be. I was Henry's wife, Mason's stepmother. Lines like that didn't bend, they broke. So I kept my head down, my hands full, waiting for the heat of it to fade. But it didn't. It simmered, quiet and stubborn, and I hated how much space it took up inside me. One evening, I was in the guest room, folding a stack of towels I'd pulled from the dryer. The house was still, Henry out in the garage tinkering with his trains again, the faint clatter of metal drifting through the walls. I smoothed a towel flat, pressing the creases out with more care than it needed, when Mason appeared in the doorway. His frame filled the space, hands shoved in his pockets, his expression firm. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but unyielding. I didn't look up, kept folding, the towel a shield between us. "There's nothing to talk about." "Yes, there is." He stepped inside and shut the door behind him, the click of it sharp in the quiet. My stomach dropped, but I forced my hands to stay steady, stacking the towel on the pile. I sighed, setting it down, and finally met his gaze. "Mason, whatever this is, it has to stop. It's wrong." "Is it?" He took a step closer, his tone sharp, challenging. "Because it doesn't feel wrong to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, a jolt I couldn't shake. I crossed my arms, holding myself together. "You don't understand. If Henry ever found out, he won't." He cut me off, his voice firm, almost dismissive. "And even if he did, do you really think he'd care?" He scoffed, shaking his head. "He barely notices you anymore, Grace. You know that." The truth in it stung, slicing through the flimsy wall I'd built. Henry hadn't seen me, not really, in years. I was the one who kept the house running, who filled the silence he left behind. But I wasn't his focus. Not anymore. Still, that didn't make this right. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. "That's not the point." "Then what is?" Mason pressed, closing the gap between us until he was just a step away. "Why are you fighting this? Because you're afraid of what people might think? Or because you're afraid of what you might think?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. My eyes stung, tears prickling at the corners, and I turned away, grabbing another towel to fold. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice cracking. "You're young, Mason. You don't get what this could do, to me, to us, to everything." He didn't move, but I could feel him watching me, his silence louder than words. "Maybe I don't," he said finally, softer now. "But I know what I felt the other night. And I know you felt it too." I froze, the towel slipping from my hands. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the lie wouldn't form. Instead, I turned back to him, my breath shallow. It doesn't matter what I felt. It stops here. It has to. For a moment, he just looked at me, his hazel eyes searching mine like he was waiting for me to crack. Then he nodded, a small, tight gesture. "If that's what you want," he said, his voice even, but there was something in his gaze, a flicker of defiance, a promise this wasn't over. He stepped back, opened the door, and left without another word. I stood there, hands shaking as I picked up the towel again. The room felt too small, the air too thin. I folded it slowly, mechanically, trying to steady myself, but my heart wouldn't settle. I'd drawn the line, said the words, but they felt hollow. because deep down, I knew the truth. I was fighting a pull I wasn't sure I could resist much longer.